Good evening, X Winterview, back again with another brief dialogue for his dear friend Anastasia. In my car, as usual, on my way home, as usual, hard-working psychologist X Winterview. So, what are we going to talk about tonight? This evening, clears his throat. Thought he'd talk about X Winterview's favourite subject. X Winterview himself. What or who is X Winterview? Some of you have been asking in private messages to tell a little bit about the story. I am reluctant to talk about the story for fear that it will confuse or annoy, perhaps. Why is that? The story is exactly that, a story. It is contingent on my ability to tell it. It is contingent on my memory as it appears in mind, biased by impressions, solidified and objectified by mind, reified into a person who has something called a life, who had a pathway, who was born, and so on and so forth, all giving the impression that there might be something of value in that artificial construct. However, I know that people are just curious as well. So, why not? X Winterview was born in China to a very loving and normal family, I suppose you might say. What else? That's about it. That's the end of the story. No, just kidding. The childhood was quite unusual in that it was a fairly remote childhood, quite isolated. Not many other children to play with for some reason. Maybe they didn't like me, I don't know. But seriously, there just actually wasn't that many kids around. So X Winterview spent a lot of time by himself. Not that he minded. In fact, X Winterview decided he preferred his own company from a very young age, and would spend every spare moment of his childhood, if he could, underwater, with his flippers, his diving mask, his Speedos, of course, and his diving wristwatch, pride and joy. Held correct time up to 50 meters. Not that X Winterview ever got to that staggering depth. In mid-childhood, age, I don't know, let's call it 8 or 9, something unusual happened or seemed to happen to X Winterview. He was fascinated with the clock on the shelf in the living room. What was fascinating, at the time at least, was that the passage of the hands of the clock would somehow indicate the passing of time. Yet, X did not believe that for a moment. For some strange reason, who knows why, it seemed like a lie. That the movement of the hands would somehow indicate the passage of time. The reason for this doubt or this skepticism was that X could remove the glass from the clock face if his parents weren't watching, and he could put his finger in the way of the second hand, which would effectively stop time. This blew his mind at the time, thinking that he was literally stopping time. However, he knew as well that that was a bit silly, so the little childhood brain at the time tried to reconcile the passing of time, the movement of the clock, and the fact that time did not seem to pass at all. There was no sense of it passing. And then it occurred to that child, somehow, and I have no idea how, that there was no time. It was just an appearance. And that X was the space in which that appearance took place. I wouldn't use all those fancy pants words like the manifestation of all creation and all those very grand terms, but a very plain, simple understanding of that was apparent from a very young age, but it was meaningless in a way too. It didn't impact on the life at all. It just was a realization of sorts at a very young age. So that was a peculiar start to the life, I'd say. Well, the story isn't that exciting, really. There's lots of bits and pieces about the life that I could fill you in on, but most people are interested in the so-called any awakening experiences or enlightenment experiences or loss of self, and so on and so forth. The stunning feature of the life is that the sense of self was more or less non-existent throughout most childhood and adolescence. There was no real sense of the self, but that, at the time looking back, could have been a function of the isolation, literally having no one to talk to for vast tracts of time, or spending most of my time underwater. Probably didn't socialize me that well, I'm guessing. But there was no distress about that either. There was no feelings of loneliness, no feelings of longing, no regret or wishing there was someone there. It was all just so terribly comfortable in a way. Moving the story forward in time, in my early, maybe mid-20s, living in Southeast Asia in an undisclosed location for security purposes, I came across a very unusual process, let's call it, a bit of a new agey thing in a health store, and just stumbled across it one day. It was called Alphabiotics, and, well, I didn't know what it was, but the gentleman seemed very nice, and I thought I'd give it a go. So I had the Alphabiotic experience, as it might be called, and, well, let's just say nothing was the same ever again. Now, I know people are going to ask me, well, did the Alphabiotic experience cause or trigger or whatever? And it's a really tricky one to answer, because the mind would want to report it as causal, but it occurs in the context of a narrative, and everything that occurs within the narrative is story, is conceptual. Nothing in the narrative causes anything else. There's no power in the story, no causal agency. So I'm very cautious about the experience and claiming it did anything, but we could say that there was an experience of some kind. I wouldn't say what it was necessarily, but the sense of self at that point, which was fairly ephemeral at the time, completely went away, and I was reminded or taken back to that childhood experience of the clock, where time seemed to stand still, or didn't really exist at all, is a better way of saying it. And in the non-existence of time, there was no space, there's no division, no separation. So there was just this profound stillness, if you want to call it a stillness. Being very cautious with the terminology, lest people think that the words point to the reality. So the profound stillness was quite stunning, in that X Winterview did not feel like talking pretty much after that experience, and took himself away to a small deserted island, not desert, I'm just kidding, a small island, had a few people on it, where he lived more or less in a grass hut. That's a slight exaggeration, it was quite a modern grass hut, but it was made of grass nonetheless, and didn't really talk to anyone for maybe a year. Now, in that year, of course, there was normal things to do during the day, going to the supermarket, getting some food, coming back to the grass hut, doing my favourite activity, which everyone knows now is being underwater, and just strolling around the beach and the jungles. It was, in some ways, a heavenly time of my life, and I would spend some time sitting in the local temples, of which I will not disclose the location of, or lest I create a stampede to that temple. Haha, no, just kidding. I just don't feel I need to say where it was. And it was as I said, it was a heavenly, very relaxing experience, you could say. And I don't know why I didn't feel like talking particularly. I know that some people are curious about it, but I actually had nothing to say. There was, in some ways, no point. But it was a happy year, and then after that, I had to kind of, well, for financial reasons, re-enter the world, you might say, and get a move on. So, now coming back into the world was very, very difficult. As you can imagine, here we have a very poorly socialized young man, barely any social contact in his childhood, prefers to be underwater, doesn't like talking very much. Well, actually, not that he doesn't like, he just doesn't see the point. So he's very comfortable with his own company and very comfortable in silence. So what profession might suit such an individual? Well, I couldn't think of any, to be honest, at the time. So I went into became a kind of counselor of sorts. Not a psychologist and not anything in particular, really. I just had a knack, you might say, of knowing what troubled people and how to help them, and decided that I was going to be like a stress counselor of sorts. And so that went fairly well for a while, helping people with stress, de-stressing them, doing some corporate work now and then, but I'm a fairly disorganized and fundamentally quite a lazy person, so I never really ramped up that business. After a while, there was a real ignition of trying to learn more about the formal aspects of counseling and stress and all that. So university seemed like a pretty good idea, and went back to study in psychology. And that was a pretty good experience. I don't know if I'd recommend it to everyone. It's much more academic than I'd originally anticipated. Anyone who's in psychology will smile at that. And eventually decided to move into the realm of clinical psychology, which is more specialist training at a master's level, and of course deals with the heavyweight mental health disorders that you often see around hospitals and clinics. So that's where X Winterview kind of landed ultimately. The question always seems to come back is, was that experience a sort of enlightenment or a liberation experience? The answer to that is yes and no. And that's an annoying and really irritating answer, I understand. But what is realized, and there can be an actual realization sort of moment, but again, don't forget it's built into the story. So in one sense it doesn't exist, it doesn't happen, because it's just a narrative. And people get very interested in the narrative as if it's something they need to emulate or try and do for themselves, and it's just not the case. But what is realized is that there never was a person in existence, and there was never anyone to be enlightened. But the mind will come back in from time to time and objectify the experience of being a person, and it seems very real at the time, real and unreal, you might say. But it's an empty experience now. It's not something that's it's not taken seriously, perhaps, is another way of saying it. It's just part of what's going on. It's the appearance of life. So you wouldn't say that there's a person there who has special powers or abilities or what have you. But I will say something on perception. When life is, I guess, seen through in a way, the understanding of some of the mechanisms of mind become more apparent, more obvious afterwards, and that might have some value or utility in the world, perhaps, but that can be learned too. That can be skills that are learned. So there's no benefit to any of it in one sense. There's no one to benefit from any of that. There's no sense of a pathway or doing practices to get to somewhere in this story, which again can be kind of annoying. And it was always a bit of a crazy story. It wasn't a really conventional story from the get-go. I know that other people's stories are a lot more conventional than X Winterview's, but that's how it unfolded here. Anyway, how it stands today is I don't know who or what I am. I could not say that for certain. I don't even know if it's worth thinking about anymore. Like, I know it's often debated of what is the self, is there a self, there is no self, blah blah blah. But that's when you really think about it, it's a sort of conceptual, it's a highly conceptualized debate or story. It's so heavily laden with concept that it's easy to forget that you're talking about concepts at the end of the day. And the concepts could be totally crazy. I mean, they just might not even be valid. I don't even know if it's worth talking about a self or a no self. I mean, really, the whole thing is a total mystery. I know that it seems that there's a self, but you could even throw away the word, and would it matter? There'd still be something. I know that I exist, but even that is, when it's looked at, is that falls away too. Do I? I don't even know if there is existence, really, and even the word, I don't know if it has any utility or meaning. So I would suggest that people who are interested in these stories about me or others who might be talking about this sort of stuff is to just hold the story very lightly. It's more of a curiosity, a passing curiosity, you might say. It's like the dialogue I gave on objectification. Remembering that the story is a process, it's an unfolding, and to take a snapshot at some point in the story gives the artificial impression of a solidity within that story, of a person who did a such and such a thing, who is going from point A to point B in space and time. Gives it gives a distorted impression of I guess you might say, the underlying reality. So be very cautious with the stories. The other thing that I would say, I get asked this quite a lot, is do I recommend any particular practices or contemplations? I guess I should probably do maybe another brief dialogue on that. I think I've done one already, but I'll look into that. I'll have to revisit that. But the answer to that is, and this is going to be an annoying answer, it doesn't really matter. I could tell you to do something, and you might actually do it, and then something might happen seemingly as a result. Or I could tell you not to do something, actually don't do anything, and something could come about as a result of that. There's no particular, I don't know, it's too great a mystery. But if you would ask me how can I relax or how can I treat a mental health problem, I'd probably have quite a lot to say about that. But would that be of any benefit to something that we might call the realization of reality or no self or whatever? I don't really think so. And I know some people that talk about this get very caught up in the whole you've got to meditate or you've got to realize something and blah blah blah. But I'm a very big believer, or I'm a big fan, you might say, of really looking at the concepts that are being used, even the languaging around stuff, and asking yourself that simple question. There's two simple questions that I would have a person ask themselves. The first question is the language and the way that I'm thinking about this, or does the language and does the way I think about this possibly not bear any relationship to the reality of what I think is going on? Look at that relationship there. And the second thing I would ask a person to look at who's genuinely interested in the whole matter is, what is the vulnerability maybe, or the discomfort or the dis-ease that I feel like I'm trying to get away from, that I think listening to these talks or learning something will help me with? And what is wrong with that discomfort that I need to get away from it? There are the only two things that I might say to a person who is seeking. There we go, back into the concepts, the person and the seeking. However, you did ask. Did you? Or did I make that up? I made that up. Anyway, this has been a brief stroll down memory lane for X Winterview into his favourite subject, X Winterview himself. Can you hear the grandiosity and the delight in my voice there as I talk about myself? Hope this was relatively interesting and informative for you, and hope it wasn't too frustratingly vague and annoying. Once again, comments are welcome. That's all for now.